Listen to me closely. I need you to look at the woman sitting quietly in the corner, not the loud one, not the popular one, not the one surrounded by applause. I'm talking about the woman with no friends, the one people misunderstood, the one they stopped inviting, the one they couldn't label, control, or predict, and they thought she was lonely. But what they didn't know was that her silence was not emptiness. It was preparation. Some of the most dangerous women on earth are not surrounded by people. They are surrounded by purpose. Now hear me when I say this. A woman with no friends is not abandoned. She is unassigned. She is not rejected. She is redirected. She is not isolated because she is weak. She is isolated because her destiny requires clarity. See, everybody can't walk with you when you're being refined. Everybody can't hear God's voice when it's being whispered only to you. And sometimes God will remove the noise before he releases the next level. So if you've ever wondered why your circle got smaller, why the calls stopped, why you outgrew rooms you used to fit in, let me talk to you for a moment, because some of you have been carrying this question in your spirit and you never said it out loud. You've been wondering, why am I so alone at this stage of my life? You didn't plan it this way. You didn't ask for the separation. People just fell off. Conversations changed. Rooms felt smaller. And if you're honest, there were nights when you wondered if something was wrong with you. But the first came to stand here today and tell you the truth you were never taught. Isolation is not punishment. It is positioning. Hear me clearly. When God wants to discipline you, he corrects you. But when God wants to develop you, he separates you. Everybody doesn't get removed because they are bad people. Some people are removed because they are bad for the version of you that is being formed. You see, before anything great is released, it must first be hidden. Gold is not refined in a crowded room. Diamonds are not formed in daylight. And strength is not built in comfort. Strength is built in pressure, in quiet places, in moments when you have nobody to lean on but God and your own integrity. There are things God cannot say to you in a noisy environment. There are instructions he will not give you when too many voices are influencing your decisions. Because if he told you your next move while everyone was still around, you might negotiate it. You might explain it. You might water it down to make other people comfortable. So he removes the audience first. Not because you are unworthy of love, but because what he's doing in you is too sacred to be interrupted. Isolation exposes what was hidden. When the crowd leaves, excuses leave too. You can no longer blame people for why you haven't healed, why you haven't grown, why you haven't stepped forward. In isolation, you meet yourself, and that meeting is uncomfortable. That's why most people run from being alone. They stay busy, they stay distracted, they stay surrounded, because silence forces you to confront what applause helped you avoid. But the woman who survives isolation comes out with clarity, not confusion. Positioning means alignment. It means God is lining you up with who you are becoming, not who you used to be. Some relationships were only assigned to the old version of you. They were comfortable with your insecurity. They were familiar with your silence. They benefited from your availability. But the moment you started growing a backbone, the moment you started asking better questions, the moment you stopped shrinking to fit, misalignment occurred. And misalignment always creates distance. You weren't rejected. You were relocated. You weren't pushed away. You were pulled forward, because elevation requires space. You can't rise if you're constantly being pulled sideways by people who don't understand the direction you're going. God had to clear the field so you could hear his voice without interference. And sometimes that clearing feels like loss, but it's actually mercy. Isolation teaches you discernment. When you're alone long enough, you learn the difference between companionship and attachment. You learn the difference between love and dependence. You learn that peace is more valuable than popularity. And once you learn that, you can never unlearn it. That's why when people try to return to the version of you they once knew, it doesn't fit anymore. You've been positioned too far ahead. Let me say this slowly. If isolation didn't destroy you, it designed you. If you're still standing, still breathing, still hoping, still praying, still dreaming, then the season worked. You didn't break. You bent, you adjusted, you shed weight, and you became lighter. And lighter things rise faster. The woman who understands this stops begging for seats at tables she was meant to build. She stops questioning her worth based on who stayed. She realizes that preparation often feels like abandonment to the untrained mind, but to the spiritually mature, it feels like focus. So don't rush out of isolation prematurely. Don't fill the space just to avoid the silence. Let the work finish. Let the strengthening complete. Because when positioning is over, connection returns. But this time, it returns with alignment, with purpose, and with people who can walk at your pace. Isolation was not the end of your story. It was the corridor between who you were and who you're about to become. And when you step out of this season, you won't step out empty. You'll step out equipped. This message is not to shame you. This message is to awaken you. Let me speak to the woman who started seeing things before other people were ready to admit them. You didn't wake up one day and decide to distance yourself. You didn't set out to be different. You simply noticed. You noticed the shift in energy. You noticed the inconsistency behind the smiles. You noticed when words didn't match actions. And the moment you noticed, you changed. That's why you don't have many friends. Not because you are difficult, not because you are cold, but because discernment will always separate you from the crowd. Discernment is not suspicion. It's perception. It's the quiet ability to sense truth without needing proof. It's knowing when something feels off even when it looks right. And a woman with discernment doesn't need chaos to reveal itself publicly. She feels it privately. That's why she steps back early. That's why she withdraws before the explosion. And people don't always understand that. They call it distance. They call it arrogance. They call it change. But what it really is wisdom growing faster than comfort. Discernment changes how you tolerate behavior. Things you once laughed at no longer feel funny. Conversations you once enjoyed now feel empty. You don't argue. You don't announce your exit. You don't explain yourself in long paragraphs. You stop showing up the same way. And when you do that, people feel it. They may not know why, but they feel the shift. Because discernment quietly removes you from environments that no longer match your spirit. The problem is most people bond through dysfunction. They connect through shared wounds, shared complaints, shared distractions. But when you start healing, when your awareness increases, you can no longer bond the same way. You stop oversharing. You stop seeking advice from people who haven't mastered their own lives. You stop needing constant affirmation. And that's when your circle begins to shrink. Not because you think you're better, but because you're no longer blind. Discernment makes you selective. You begin to understand that access is sacred, that not everyone deserves your vulnerability, your energy, your time. You realize that being surrounded doesn't mean being supported. And once you see that, you can't pretend anymore. Pretending would cost you your peace. And a discerning woman will always choose peace over performance. This is why people with discernment often walk alone. Not because they want to, but because clarity is rare. It's lonely to see clearly in a world that survives on denial. It's isolating to notice patterns when others are committed to ignoring them. But that isolation is the price of wisdom. You pay for insight with solitude. And if you didn't have discernment, you'd still be surrounded by confusion, surrounded by manipulation, surrounded by emotional debt. Discernment also exposes motives. You start to recognize when people love what you provide more than who you are. You sense when relationships are transactional. You feel when your presence is appreciated only when it's convenient. And once you see that, you don't become bitter, you become boundaried. You stop pouring endlessly into containers that never fill. You stop rescuing people who refuse to heal. And that decision alone disqualifies you from many friendships. A discerning woman doesn't need drama to exit. She doesn't need betrayal to leave. Sometimes all she needs is awareness. And awareness will always offend those who benefit from your unawareness. That's why they say you changed. That's why they don't call anymore. That's why the connection faded without a fight. Discernment ended what comfort wanted to continue. Let me tell you something powerful. Discernment is protection disguised as loneliness. It shields you from future heartbreaks you'll never have to experience. It blocks doors you don't need to walk through. It saves you from conversations that would have drained you. And even though it feels quiet now, even though it feels like you're walking alone, you are actually walking safely. And the woman who honors her discernment becomes dangerous to dysfunction. She can't be easily lied to. She can't be easily used. She can't be easily manipulated because she listens beyond words. She watches patterns. She trusts what her speech recognizes. And people who thrive on confusion cannot survive around clarity. So if you've been wondering why your friendships faded as your awareness grew, stop blaming yourself. You didn't lose friends, you lost illusions. You didn't become distant, you became discerning. And that discernment didn't remove people to punish you. It removed them to protect you. Because the truth is, the right people don't fear your discernment. They respect it. They don't feel threatened by your clarity. They feel safe in it. And when they arrive, they won't need you to be blind to belong. Until then, stand firm in your awareness. Trust what you see. Honor what you feel. Because discernment didn't make you alone. It made you awake. Let me speak to the woman who learned how to be quiet without disappearing, because there is a difference between silence that is weakness and silence that is wisdom. You didn't stop talking because you had nothing to say. You stopped talking because you realized that not everyone deserves access to your thoughts, your plans, your pain, or your process. Your silence is not absence. It is intention. It is discipline. It is strategy. At some point, you noticed that every time you spoke too soon, something got delayed. Every time you explained yourself, you felt drained. Every time you announced your next move, resistance showed up before support did. So you learned, you adapted. You began to guard your words not out of fear, but out of understanding, because a man who understands timing knows that revelation before readiness can sabotage destiny. Silence sharpens observation. When you stop speaking, you start seeing. You hear what people say when they think you're not listening. You notice who only shows up when they need something. You recognize patterns in behavior that words were once distracting you from. Silence takes away the noise and exposes the truth. And truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. People often mistake silence for passivity. They think if you're not arguing, you're agreeing. If you're not explaining, you're confused. If you're not reacting, you're weak. But they don't understand the power of restraint. They don't realize that silence is how a woman gathers information without revealing her position. It's how she protects her next move from interference. It's how she remains calm while everyone else is emotional. Your silence became your strategy because you learned that energy follows words. Every time you speak, you release something. And you became intentional about what you release and where. You stopped feeding conversations that went nowhere. You stopped defending yourself to people who had already decided how they wanted to see you. You stopped trying to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding you. And in that restraint, you gained control. Silence also taught you self-mastery. It trained you to respond instead of react, to pause instead of explode, to think instead of vent. And that discipline changed you. You realized that not every battle needs a response. Not every comment needs correction. Not every misunderstanding needs clarification. Some things resolve themselves when you don't give them your voice. While others were busy broadcasting their every move, you were building quietly. While others were explaining dreams to people who couldn't carry them, you were nurturing yours in private. While others were seeking validation through noise, you were developing confidence through consistency. And that quiet work, that's what makes your presence heavy when you finally speak. There is authority in measured words. When a silent woman finally opens her mouth, people listen because they know she doesn't talk just to hear herself. Her words carry weight because they are rare, they are filtered, they are intentional. And that intimidates people who rely on volume instead of substance. Silence also protected your heart. You learned that oversharing creates vulnerability in the wrong places. that not everyone who listens cares, that some people collect information not to support you, but to use it later. So you became selective. You learned how to be open without being exposed. You learned how to be honest without being unguarded. And that balance is power. There were moments when silence was misunderstood. People assumed you were distant, cold, uninterested. They filled the gaps with their own narratives because you didn't correct them. But you made peace with that. Because you understood that people who truly know you don't need constant explanation, and people who don't know you won't understand no matter how much you say. Your silence was never about hiding. It was about honing. It was about letting your actions speak louder than your intentions. It was about moving with precision instead of noise. And in that quiet, you develop patience. You learn to wait for the right moment. You learn to let things unfold without forcing them. You learn that timing can be more powerful than speed. And here's the truth most people miss. Silence is not emptiness. It is fullness under control. It is strength that doesn't need to announce itself. It is confidence that doesn't need approval. It is wisdom that knows when to speak and when to let things be. So if you've been quiet lately, don't rush to fill the space. Don't let anyone pressure you into explaining what you're still building. Your silence is not a setback. It is a setup. It is the space where clarity forms, where resolve deepens, where strategy matures. And when you speak again, it won't be to convince. It won't be to defend. It won't be to explain. It will be to declare. Let me talk to the woman who discovered something most people never learn: the ability to sit with herself without running away. You didn't get there overnight. At first, the quiet was uncomfortable. The silence felt loud when there was no one to text, no one to distract you, no one to affirm you. All the thoughts you had been postponing finally showed up. And that's where the real work began. Because self-awareness is not born in crowds, it is born in solitude. You learned that loneliness and aloneness are not the same thing. Loneliness is the ache for connection. Aloneness is the presence of self. And once you cross that line, once you learn how to be present with your own thoughts, emotions, and contradictions, you became powerful in a way few people ever do. You stopped fearing your own company. You stopped needing noise to feel alive. You stopped chasing people just to avoid facing yourself. Self-awareness means you know who you are when no one is watching. You understand your triggers. You recognize your patterns. You can admit your flaws without self-destruction and acknowledge your strengths without arrogance. That level of honesty requires courage. Most people would rather be surrounded than be self-aware, because self-awareness demands accountability. It forces you to stop blaming others for what you haven't healed. When you became self-aware, you stopped outsourcing your happiness. You realized it was unfair to expect others to carry emotional weight you hadn't learned to manage yourself. You stopped entering relationships looking to be rescued. You stopped confusing attention with affection, and that shift alone disqualified many connections from your life, because people who thrive on dependency struggle around independence. You learned how to process your emotions instead of projecting them. When you were angry, you didn't explode, you examined. When you were hurt, you didn't perform, you reflected. When you were disappointed, you didn't spiral, you asked better questions. That internal dialogue changed you. It made you emotionally fluent. And emotional fluency is intimidating to people who survive by avoidance. Self-awareness also taught you discernment about timing. You learned when to engage and when to retreat, when to speak and when to listen, when to push and when to pause. You stopped reacting impulsively and started responding intentionally. That's why people can't easily provoke you anymore. They don't realize they're dealing with someone who has already met her shadows and made peace with her light. Sitting with yourself also healed your relationship with validation. You no longer need constant reassurance because you understand your worth from the inside. Compliments are appreciated but not required. Criticism is considered but not absorbed blindly. You became anchored. And anchored people don't drift with opinions. This is why your circle got smaller, not because you became antisocial, but because you became authentic. You can't maintain shallow connections once you've gone deep within yourself. Small talk feels exhausting when you've had honest conversations with your own soul and you refuse to shrink your awareness just to belong. Self-awareness also brought compassion. You stopped expecting perfection from yourself and from others. You understand that everyone is fighting something you can't see, but compassion didn't make you a doormat. It gave you boundaries. You learned that understanding someone does not mean tolerating their behavior, and that balance is rare. You are not lonely. You are self-aware. You don't need to be constantly surrounded because you know how to replenish yourself. You don't panic in silence because you've learned how to listen inward. You don't fear being alone because you know you are not empty. And here's the quiet truth. People who haven't met themselves find it hard to stay around someone who has. Your presence mirrors what they avoid. Your calm highlights their chaos. Your depth exposes their surface. And instead of rising to meet you, some will drift away. Let them go, because the woman who can sit with herself can stand anywhere. She is not easily shaken. She is not easily manipulated. She is not easily lost. She knows who she is, and that knowing becomes her compass. So if you find yourself alone, not aching, not desperate, not broken, but steady, honor that. You've reached a level where solitude is not a threat, it's a resource. And from that place, every connection you choose is not a need, but a choice. And a woman who chooses rather than needs is powerful beyond measure. Let me speak to the woman who reached the moment where applause stopped mattering. Not because you don't appreciate encouragement, not because affirmation has no value, but because you finally understood something that changed everything. Validation is a poor substitute for self-trust. You didn't wake up one day confident. You earned it through disappointment, through being misunderstood, through showing up for yourself when no one else did. And somewhere along the way, you stopped asking the room who you were. There was a time when approval felt like oxygen, when being liked felt like safety, when rejection felt personal. You adjusted your tone, softened your truth, edited your desires just to remain accepted. You learned how to read the room before you read your own heart, and it worked. For a while you were included, you were praised, you were welcomed, but you were also exhausted because performing for validation cost you pieces of yourself every time. The shift happened quietly. It wasn't dramatic, it was a realization. You noticed that even when people clapped, you still felt empty. Even when you were affirmed, you still felt unsure, because applause can't stabilize an identity you haven't rooted internally. And that's when you began doing the internal work. Without witnesses, without guarantees, without instant rewards. You started keeping promises to yourself, small ones at first, saying no when you meant no. Resting when your body asked for it, walking away from conversations that required you to betray your values. Each act of self-respect strengthened your inner voice, and the louder your inner voice became, the quieter the need for extra. Now approval grew. When you no longer seek validation, your behavior changes. You stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop defending your growth to people who benefit from your stagnation. You stop negotiating your worth to stay included. And that makes people uncomfortable, because validation seekers are predictable, but self-assured women are not. You don't announce every achievement anymore. You don't broadcast every struggle. You don't need everyone to understand your decisions. You've learned that clarity doesn't require consensus. And the moment you stop needing agreement, you stepped into authority. Authority doesn't come from being loud, it comes from being grounded, from knowing who you are even when no one is watching, from making choices aligned with your values rather than reactions fueled by approval. And once you taste that kind of freedom, you can't go back. Because validation is addictive, but self-trust is stabilizing. This is why your circle changed. People who thrived on your availability struggle with your boundaries. People who benefited from your people-pleasing feel threatened by your independence. You're no longer easily guilted, easily pressured, easily swayed. And when validation no longer controls you, manipulation loses its power. You learn how to sit with discomfort without rushing to soothe it with attention. You learn how to be unseen without questioning your significance. You learn being overlooked doesn't diminish your value. It refines your focus. And that understanding made you resilient. Let me say this clearly. A woman who no longer seeks validation cannot be controlled. She doesn't chase approval from authority figures. She doesn't shape her truth to fit popular opinion. She doesn't measure her worth by likes, invites, or applause. She listens inward first, and that inner alignment becomes her compass. This doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care wisely. You receive feedback without surrendering your identity. You appreciate recognition without becoming dependent on it. You stay teachable without becoming malleable. That balance is rare. And rarity often looks like isolation before it looks like influence. You may have noticed that when you stopped seeking validation, silence followed. Fewer messages, fewer invitations, less noise, but more peace, more clarity, more direction. Because when you stop performing, only the real connections remain. And real connections don't require constant proving. You also stop competing. You no longer compare timelines, achievements, or appearances. You understand that comparison is a distraction from purpose. And when you're anchored in purpose, you move differently. You move patiently. You move intentionally. You move without needing permission. The woman who doesn't seek validation becomes a standard, not because she demands attention, but because her presence commands respect. She doesn't need to announce her worth. It's felt. It's seen. It's evident in how she walks away from what doesn't serve her without drama, without bitterness, without explanation. So if you're in a season where approval doesn't move you like it used to, don't panic. You didn't become cold. You became clear. You didn't lose your heart. You strengthened it. And clarity is dangerous to systems built on insecurity. You are no longer asking the world who you are. You already know. Let me speak to the woman whose strength was not built on a stage, not polished in public, not applauded while it was forming. Your strength was built in private, in moments no one saw, in battles no one clapped for, in tears you wiped away before anyone noticed. You didn't become strong because life was kind to you. You became strong because life was honest with you when no one else was around. There were seasons when it felt like you were doing everything alone. No one checking in, no one asking how you were really doing, no one carrying the weight with you. And at first that felt unfair. It felt heavy. It felt like neglect. But slowly something started happening inside of you. You stopped waiting for rescue. You stopped expecting support that never came. You started figuring things out on your own. And that's where strength was born. Private strength doesn't look impressive while it's developing. It looks like endurance. It looks like getting up when you're tired. It looks like choosing dignity when bitterness will be easier. It looks like crying in the shower and showing up composed. It looks like praying with no witnesses. It looks like making hard decisions with no reassurance that they'll pay off. You learned how to self-soothe instead of self-destruct, how to think instead of panic, how to hold yourself together when everything felt like it was coming apart. And that kind of strength is different. It's quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation. It just holds. While others were building confidence through compliments, you were building resilience through survival. While others were encouraged by crowds, you were forged by solitude. And the thing about strength built in private is that it doesn't collapse in public because you didn't borrow it from anyone. You earned it. You learned how to keep going without motivation, how to stay disciplined when feelings fluctuated, how to finish things even when no one noticed your effort. That taught you consistency. And consistency is more powerful than talent, more powerful than height, more powerful than approval. Private strength also gave you emotional regulation. You don't unravel easily because you've already been unraveled in private and put yourself back together. You don't explode at inconvenience because you've survived far worse in silence. You don't panic under pressure because pressure has been your classroom. People don't see the night you questioned yourself, the moment you doubted your worth, the you almost quit but didn't. They only see the composure, the calm, the confidence, and they assume it came naturally. But what they don't understand is that grace on the outside usually means grit on the inside. Your strength was built when no one was clapping, which is why you don't crumble when no one is cheering now. You learned how to approve of yourself, how to validate your own progress, how to measure success internally instead of externally. And that made you steady. Private strength teaches you humility too. You don't need to dominate rooms to feel significant. You don't need to prove anything to feel accomplished. You don't need attention to feel secure. You know what you've survived, and that knowledge grounds you. This is also why you don't rush into connections anymore. You understand how much work it took to become who you are. You're not willing to hand access to people who haven't earned trust. You protect your peace because you know how hard it was to build it. Strength built in private also makes you compassionate. You don't judge quickly because you know what hidden battles feel like. You don't assume weakness because you've learned that survival doesn't always look loud, but compassion doesn't mean tolerance. You've learned how to be kind without being careless, how to be understanding without being exploited. And when challenges come now, you don't collapse, you adjust, you don't dramatize, you strategize, you don't seek pity, you seek solutions. Bet Oz, your strength wasn't built to impress people, it was built to sustain you. There will be moments when people underestimate you because they didn't see your process. Let them. They didn't see the weight you carried, the growth you fought for, the discipline you developed. But you don't need them to know. You know, and that's enough. So if you ever wonder why you're so solid now, why you don't shake the way you used to, why you can stand alone without falling apart, it's because your strength was constructed in places applause couldn't reach. And strength built in private doesn't fade in public. Let me speak to the woman who walks alone, not because she wants distance, but because she is out in front. You didn't separate yourself to be dramatic. You didn't pull away to be superior. You simply kept moving when others got comfortable standing still. And leadership has a cost that few people talk about, the cost of being early. When you walk ahead, the view changes. You start seeing consequences before they happen. You start recognizing patterns while others are still excusing them. You start preparing for seasons people haven't entered yet. And that foresight creates distance, not because you think differently on purpose, but because you see differently. And seeing differently means you can't always stay where everyone else is standing. Leaders are often lonely before they are followed, not because they lack love, but because vision isolates before it attracts. You felt that. You tried slowing down so others could keep up. You tried explaining what you saw so they wouldn't feel left behind. But vision can't be transferred through words alone. Some people have to experience life before they understand what you already know. So you kept walking, and the farther you walked, the quieter it became. Conversations that once energized you started feeling repetitive. Advice that once sounded wise began to feel limited. The laughter didn't hit the same. The rooms didn't stretch you anymore. And it wasn't arrogance, it was growth. You outgrew spaces before people outgrew you. Walking ahead means you carry responsibility even when no one assigned it to you. You think long term when others think moment to moment. You weigh impact while others chase comfort. You ask, what will this cost me later? While others ask, how does this feel right now? And that difference in thinking creates separation long before it creates respect. People misunderstand leaders before they trust them. They label you distant because they can't access your inner world. They call you quiet because they don't hear your internal dialogue. They assume you've changed because they don't recognize the pace you're moving at. And instead of chasing understanding, you chose integrity. You let your life explain what your mouth no longer needed to. Leadership also teaches restraint. You learn that reacting emotionally could derail what you're building, that explaining yourself too much could invite unnecessary resistance, that bringing everyone along before they're ready could slow the entire mission. So you learned how to carry vision quietly, how to wait, how to move without validation. Walking ahead means you face uncertainty first. You step into unfamiliar territory without a map. You make decisions without guarantees. You trust instincts before results confirm them. And that's terrifying. That's why many people don't lead, they prefer certainty over calling. But you chose courage over comfort, even when it cost you companionship. There were moments you questioned yourself, moments you wondered if slowing down would make life easier, moments you thought about turning back just to feel familiar again. But every time you tried, something inside you resisted. Because once you've seen forward, you can't pretend backward. Leadership also means being misunderstood in silence. You don't always get credit. You don't always get appreciation. Sometimes you don't even get acknowledgement. But you're not driven by recognition. You're driven by responsibility. You understand that being first doesn't mean being celebrated. It means being accountable. And here's the truth. People will eventually follow what proves itself. They may doubt you at first. They may question your distance. They may feel uncomfortable with your independence. But when life shifts, when pressure comes, when clarity is needed, they'll look for the one who already walked ahead. That's when leadership becomes visible. But even then, you won't gloat. You won't say, "I told you so." Because leadership isn't about being right. It's about being ready. And you've been preparing in solitude for moments others didn't see coming. Walking alone sharpened you. It taught you how to rely on wisdom instead of consensus, how to trust your judgment when opinions conflicted, how to stand firm without applause. And that firmness became your foundation. So if you're wondering why your path feels quiet, why your pace feels different, why your journey feels solitary, understand this. Leaders often walk alone because they are carving paths, not following trails. You are not behind. You are not lost. You are not isolated by accident. You are ahead. And one day, what feels like distance now will be recognized as direction. It holds. Let me speak to the woman who no longer needs someone else to regulate her emotions. You didn't become emotionally independent because you stopped caring. You became emotionally independent because you learned how expensive it is to depend on unstable people for stability. This independence was not born out of bitterness. It was born out of awareness. You realized that expecting others to carry your emotional weight was unfair to them and dangerous for you. There was a time when your mood rose and fell based on how people treated you. A message could lift you. Silence could ruin your day. Approval felt like peace, and rejection felt like collapse. You didn't know it then, but you were giving people too much power over your inner world. And one day something shifted. You got tired of being emotionally hostage to circumstances you couldn't control. Emotional independence begins when you stop outsourcing your inner peace. You learned how to sit with discomfort without immediately needing reassurance. You learn how to process disappointment without projecting it onto others. You learn how to self-soothe instead of spiraling. And that learning wasn't gentle. It was forged in moments when you had no one to lean on but yourself. You stopped expecting people to read your mind. You started communicating clearly or managing your expectations quietly. You realized that unspoken needs often become silent resentments. So you took responsibility for your emotions instead of waiting for someone else to fix them. And that responsibility made you powerful. Emotionally independent women are often misunderstood. People assume you don't need anyone, when the truth is you've learned how to choose instead of cling. You still desire connection, but you don't depend on it for survival. You still value intimacy, but you don't lose yourself inside it. You still feel deeply, but you don't let feelings control your actions. This is why you don't react the way you used to. You pause, you assess, you respond when necessary. Silence no longer means abandonment to you, it means space. Distance no longer feels like rejection, it feels like clarity. You don't chase closure from people who can give it. You create closure by understanding, accepting, and moving forward. Emotional independence also changed how you love. You don't love from lack anymore. You don't love to be chosen. You don't love to be saved. You love from fullness, from alignment, from self-respect. And that kind of love requires maturity on both sides. Not everyone can meet you there. You became aware of emotional manipulation. You noticed guilt tactics, passive aggression, emotional withdrawal. And because you no longer depend on emotional chaos for connection, those tactics stopped working on you. You don't beg for consistency. You don't negotiate basic respect. You don't stay where communication feels like punishment. Being emotionally independent doesn't mean you don't get hurt. It means you don't stay hurt longer than necessary. You allow yourself to feel, but you don't let feelings decide your future. You grieve, but you don't spiral. You reflect, but you don't ruminate. You heal without needing someone else to apologize first. This independence also taught you patience. You no longer rush to fill emotional gaps with the wrong people. You don't attach quickly just to avoid loneliness. You understand that peace is better than chemistry without safety. And that understanding narrowed your choices, but it strengthened your life. People may say you're distant now, that you're guarded, that you're hard to read. But what they don't understand is that you've learned how to protect your inner world. You've learned that emotional access is earned, not granted by default. And that protection is not coldness, it's wisdom. Emotionally independent women dawn at fear being alone because they are not emotionally abandoned when no one is around. They carry their own reassurance. They know how to calm themselves. They trust themselves to survive disappointment. And that trust becomes a quiet confidence. This is why you don't panic when connections end. You don't collapse when expectations aren't met. You don't beg people to stay. You let go with grace because you know you'll be okay. And that knowing removes desperation from your choices. Emotional independence doesn't isolate you. It refines you. It filters your relationships. It raises the standard of who gets access to you. And while it may look like loneliness from the outside, on the inside, it feels like stability. So if you've reached a place where you no longer need people to make you feel okay, honor that. You didn't become numb. You became grounded. You didn't shut down. You stabilized. And a woman who is emotionally stable is not easily shaken, easily controlled, or easily lost. She chooses connection. She does not need it to survive.